unfortunately, we've got a system which is very high stakes. And I'm not going to suggest that Ofsted are making it high stakes in that way, but it has become a monster, which, in terms of those judgments and the impacts that it has upon communities, schools, and people's careers.
Welcome to Rethinking Education. Education's critical friend.
Hello, and welcome to the Rethinking Education podcast.
Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm all right, thanks. It's a very rainy day today down here in Brighton, but it's the last day of term. We have 2 weeks of holidays ahead of us. What's not to like?
Absolutely. We're looking forward to the break. We are a school that will maybe over the next term or the term after be expecting an Ofsted, so we have that to look forward to as well.
Right, yeah. So that's hanging over the holiday. That's interesting, right from the get-go, isn't it? Because like the holiday is like if you're physically not in school, but mentally that's still there, right? It's present.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All the time. Especially more so now we've come into this academic year when we knew that the Ofsted was going to be facing us.
Yeah, right. Interesting, isn't it? And even that language facing us, it's sort of it's like we often use the language of like people I was talking to recently were talking about like winning or there's this sense of conflict or becoming combative. There is often this sense of sort of battle in some sense. Is that I don't want to put words in your mouth, but would you say that that's fair to say in the way that you think about these things?
Um, it is. I mean, I try not to. I've been through a number of Ofsted inspections, and sometimes it's been really positive to be able to go into them feeling like we've got a lot to celebrate here, and we want to celebrate what we do as a school. We've got the opportunity to be able to share it with other people. And then at other times, you're sometimes uncertain, especially if you're not quite sure what the nature of the team is, or actually what their starting points are, or how they are coming into the school to be able to see that. So they've always been interesting and challenging, but not necessarily challenging in the same positive way that I think they ought to be.
Yeah, interesting. So we'll get into the challenges shortly. I often structure the final part of these conversations. I've had many of them now, these rethinking education conversations, and I often ask people the same three questions. What are the positives? What are we getting right currently? What would you like to boost the signal of? What would you like to see more of? That sort of stuff. The second one is what are the major challenges that we face currently? And obviously this is all going to focus around Ofsted. And that could be in terms of the framework. It could be the very idea of inspection. It could be, just like some examples of things that have happened to you or that haven't happened that you felt should have happened, for example. What it's like to be, on the receiving end of Ofsted, both positives and challenges. And then the third part is potential solutions. How can we move into a better way of doing this, into a less bad way of doing this, if you like? Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that's fine. That's great.
Perfect. So let's start with the positives then. What do you think is good about Ofsted or about inspection more widely? And again, this could be at a policy level, it could be about the framework, or it could be about your experiences. You might have had positive experiences with, by the way, how many inspections have you?
I think I must have gone through about 8 or 9 inspections now. If I think about it, I've been in 2 schools which were in special measures. They were in inadequate. So that was the time when we were being visited more frequently. So we'd had, drop-in inspections through that process as well. But certainly over the last 8, 9 years, I've been through 3 Ofsted inspections.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And sorry, I forgot to ask earlier, but would you please just share a little bit about yourself and the role that you currently do and the roles that you've done up until this point?
Yeah, I'm currently head teacher in a 11 to 18 secondary school. Prior to that, I'd been a principal of a single academy trust. And prior to that, for 10 years, worked as a vice principal in a large school of about 1,500, an upper school. Um, and before that, I'd been a deputy head in a school in some challenging circumstances. And I became that deputy as a result of being seconded onto the senior team in the previous school where I'd gone, which had also been in serious weaknesses. Prior to that, I'd operated probably for about 15 years as a classroom teacher.
Got you. Thank you. Thank you. So a long and distinguished career in many different roles. So yeah, the positives then.
I think it's essential that we are accountable to our communities, that actually people know that they can trust what's going on within a school. Um, our approach, and I know lots of head teachers' approaches, is to be open and transparent about what they do, and they share what's going on within their schools. They're open with people. I think, unfortunately, you can't necessarily trust, and trust is often an issue that I sort of raise with colleagues I'm working with. Trust sometimes isn't enough. You need to be able to make sure that you've got structures in place, and it's the structures that you trust rather than the individuals, because individuals change. So
Mm.
schools can change, the leadership of it can change, and so therefore, instead of rebuilding that trust again, I think you need an organised structure so that there is an element of confidence about what's going on. However, at the same time, I think you need to put the idea of Ofsted inspections clearly into context. I have the view that they should really be seen in the same way that MOTs are seen for cars. That there is a check that actually what is working. Is this school functioning well? If it's not functioning well, what are the areas that actually need to be addressed? And much like with a car, that you then go, oh, well, I'm not going to scrap the whole car. I'm not going to stop driving it anymore. I'm not going to actually start speaking badly about it, but I'm actually going to fix the bits that are wrong. I'm going to take it to people who actually know what needs to be done to be able to help me sort it out. And we can then turn that journey around fairly quickly. So I've been
In,
very, very clear that actually always in the past that I think that approach is better. It is unfortunately we've got a system which is very high stakes. And I'm not going to suggest that Ofsted are making it high stakes in that way, but it has become a monster, which, in terms of those judgments and the impacts that it has upon communities, schools, and people's careers.
yeah, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And also that idea that MOTs, I like that metaphor because it would be ridiculous, wouldn't it, to take your car for an MOT and then they fail it, and then you have to you have to just like drive this car around for the next 3 years with the word inadequate written across the top of the windscreen, to
Mm,
advertise
mm.
it to everybody. Nobody would want to go near that car,
No,
would they? But
no.
it's like obviously that's not how it works. You go and get your wheels fixed or whatever it is, your brake fluid, and you get it rechecked, and you're back on the road within the day or within the week. It seems ridiculous that we don't have a system that's analogous to that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think so long as there's that transparency, and I think so long as there is some sort of uh, clarity for the community that the school serves as to what are those areas that need to be fixed, and that the school is quite clear in terms of what it's doing in terms of being able to make sure that we are back on track, that we are providing the education that every young child deserves, then I think that's a system that is appropriate for what we do within education.
Mm.
We have ended up more of a situation that people bark for the blood of football managers, and that seems to be what's happening also in education. That actually the fix is seen, change the personnel, change things around, buy in new players, and and that will be the solution.
Yeah, yeah. So trying to stay on positives for a while. I like the idea. So you're basically saying that inspections are a good idea, that we should be held accountable, that the idea is generally a good one. I wonder if you could point to, is there anything that you particularly think is good about either the current or previous inspection framework? Something that you think, actually, do you know what? That's pretty reasonable, and I'm happy to go along with that.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been long enough now in my career to remember the days of week-long inspections
Mm.
when there was a large team of inspectors who would come in, and there would be a really lengthy report that would be written, and you would actually feel as a teacher, and this was before I became involved in senior leadership, that you would actually feel that the inspection team had been able to spend enough quality time within an institution to be able to really start digging under and writing things that actually would help the future of the school and help the future of individual departments and individual teachers.
Mm.
That I think was some positive experiences. They were stressful, but they were positive in the sense that actually you felt that people were there to be able to really find out as much as possible about the school. That clearly has some threats when actually you've got limited time under current regime to be able to manage to fully get your ideas around the whole school. Um, and I think I have met many inspectors who have been thoughtful and helpful and really wanted to be able to make sure that they were giving advice and guidance that was succeeding. So I think individuals that have worked within the system have been themselves professional and really positive in terms of helping a school continue on its journey.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that I would echo that. I can remember all of the stress. It's very stressful, isn't it, being inspected, and like the call, like getting the news of the call, and there's often the air turns blue at that moment. Like people are, like a little bit pushed out of their comfort zone. They're thinking, oh my goodness, like what day are they coming in? What classes have I got on that day? Are there any particularly difficult classes that I've got that day? During the inspection, I remember that whenever the door handle would go on my room, I would get this shock of adrenaline just like would flood through my system, and it's just like a kid coming back from the toilet usually. Or actually, it turns out to be an Ofsted inspector, and that's also quite a surreal experience
Mm.
where you sort of, because you've spent so long sort of thinking about it, worrying about it, like you were talking about, it doesn't leave you. Then you actually get one in your classroom, and it's like, oh my god, it's happening! It's
Yeah.
happening! Oh my goodness, they're you start to try to sort of picture what it's looking like from their eyes, or you go over and welcome them to the room, and sometimes they're quite friendly, and sometimes they just basically air you and go and sit down somewhere coldly, and you
Mm.
think, oh,
Mm.
that's not good. And it's so heightened. The whole thing is just incredibly heightened, and whatever it is that they're seeing is not normal because of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Hawthorne effect. Like that the observer affects what is observed. That so clearly has been the case in the lessons that I've been inspected. Um, and yet, despite all of that, I've often felt that I have had very reasonable conversations with Ofsted inspectors. We were both just speaking before we started recording about how we've both in the past been able to persuade an Ofsted inspector that they got it wrong, and that we said
Mm.
actually that was a good or an outstanding lesson, and they changed their grade, which is an amazing thing for them to do, to acknowledge that they had made a mistake and to do so openly. There are many sort of positive aspects of it, and like you say, because people, like, I've never met a teacher who said we should not be held to account. I don't think that anybody thinks that it shouldn't happen at all. And sometimes you do leave it, even though it's been this very heightened, sort of charged experience that's sort of unpleasant in many ways. Afterwards, you sometimes sort of just feel that actually it was kind of a positive experience in some sense, that you feel like when it's been done fairly, you feel like actually, yeah, I think that they captured a reasonable representation of what's happening. I feel okay with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think another positive is actually the amount of experiences that I've been fortunate to go through, where you feel as a school that the students really want to be able to do their best by you. That actually they recognise that actually in the most successful inspections that I've been involved in, that the students want the outcome to be good. They want
Yeah.
it to be good, not only for you as a teacher, but for you, for them as students, and for the school itself. That's a real positive that sometimes comes out of the experience.
Absolutely. Although, as you say that, a memory comes to mind of a child who once pulled a Mooney out the window at an Ofsted inspector. So they're not always on board.
No, indeed, and actually, I've got an example when working in the school which was in serious weaknesses, that a child had tripped up an Ofsted inspector as they were walking along the corridor.
Oh, that's not going to land well, is
That
it?
didn't go down very well at all.
No. Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's another thing, right? Because yeah, the kids, the Ofsted coming makes it so that the kids are either with you or against you in some way. And
Mhm.
I've had that with some characters trying to, not, I think it was not within an Ofsted inspector, but with some sort of a school improvement partner, a normally perfectly polite and compliant student just decided to just be awkward, and she
Mm.
knew what she was doing, and she was sitting on the same table that this guy was sitting at, and it was really weird. But it was, you know, she just clearly decided that she was just going to, you know, have fun with this. Yeah, so that's interesting. It can sort of, it can create either alliances or division lines between teachers and their students.
Yes. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, is there anything else in the positives column before we move into challenges?
No, I think it is. It is all down to that accountability aspect, which I've always think is vital for schools, that they should be, we should be open in terms of what we're doing at all times with all our stakeholders that are involved.
Yeah, completely. Okay, so let's move into challenges then. And again, this could be at the level of inspection as an abstract concept with the current framework, or with, you know, you could talk about some particular experiences that you've lived through. And another way of asking that might be to just ask, like, why did you respond to my request for people to talk about? Was there something in particular that you sort of felt that you would like to share?
Yes, I think when any organisation is under scrutiny, I think it's really important that actually everything is looked at in terms of what's going well, and actually, as we talked about what's going well, but actually what needs to be addressed. And I think there needs to be a recognition of the pressure that is put on. And I have known colleagues that I've worked with in the past who have then become leaders of schools, who are now no longer leaders of schools. Where I've gone through an experience of seeing a colleague achieve a position as head of school underneath the CEO of the academy, go through an Ofsted inspection after their first term in position, and then be moved on, and then actually lose their position. The CEO remained in place. The head of school lost their job, and I think that kind of what we see happening to people's careers, and actually whether in fact, you know, the right to people are being held accountable, I think is of concern.
Mm,
So we're seeing the impact upon individuals, and actually there's sometimes the kind of like the lack of understanding, I think, of the pressure. One of the situations I was in when we had an Ofsted inspection was not of the school, but of the nursery that we ran as part of the school. They were inspected. Well, we were inspected as part of the Ofsted inspection framework. The inspection took place just before the end of term. I was sent the report to read and was told I had to send it back in 24 hours, and I received that report on Christmas Eve. I
goodness
had
me.
enough time just before we got to the end of play on Christmas Eve. I rang them from home and said, really, I've got 24 hours. And they eventually gave me 48 hours on top of that to be able to turn it around. But I think that kind of approach doesn't really, you know, lend itself to an understanding of the kind of pressures that people are working through when they're operating in an environment under that inspection framework. That's unfortunate. And you know, there are other cases where I think we're seeing that Ofsted needs to be more open and transparent in terms of what they're doing. I think one of the problems that we've got is the blunt tool of the grading system. And I think we talked before about where you've got a large team that are able to go into schools and really dig into and give you quality responses. I think a narrative is much more helpful to be able to identify, you know, even with an MOT, which has a blunt tool of this car's passed or it has failed its MOT, but doesn't have that idea of sort of like completely writing off, which I think that, you know, the grade of being inadequate really does for many schools and for many school leaders, because it's not necessarily the whole school that is identified. It's the school leader. It has, you know, an ongoing effect for years, I think, within school and community environments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the person I was speaking to yesterday was saying that if you get that unhappy grade, that they come back within 30 months, but often it actually takes longer. It's like 38 months or something on average,
Mm-hmm.
which is a really long time. That's 2.5 years, you know, and it's
Yes.
just like
Yeah.
it's just such a, you know, schools change really quickly, don't they? They're very dynamic places. From one
Mm-hmm.
cohort to the next, there could be a high staff turnover one year, and, you know, maybe 20-30% of the staff are replaced, and that can completely change the dynamic. And the idea that you could even attribute a label to something that is so ever in such an ever-changing state of flux, this idea that the fixed label, like sometimes people say, oh, well, it's important that we do this because we're giving parents information, but we're giving them really bad information. Like, that's not a reliable marker of what that school is like. And so, should we be giving them bad information just because, it is information and they like information? That's something that we should look at.
Yeah, and I think we've got to recognise, and I think that there is pressure upon the individuals who operate as Ofsted inspectors. Fair enough, they make the choice that they are going to take on that role, but they are under incredible pressure to be able to try to turn around an inspection and to reach a judgment in a very short space of time.
mm,
And I think that that has the potential, therefore, to lead to some bad practice. The bad practice of either people going in with a preconceived idea about what's going to be happening, and I don't think that's new. I've got experience from years ago of an Ofsted inspection when I was in position as a vice principal, of being part of what we thought was a transparent discussion with the Ofsted team, in terms of them making their judgment, and then suggesting that actually there should be a break for 15 minutes to get a cup of tea, and then in returning to that meeting, it was quite clear that it just hadn't been a break for a cup of tea, but actually a decision had been made, and it wasn't as open and transparent a discussion as perhaps we had thought. Um, and I think it's that openness, and I think that we need to be able to make sure we've got in place. But it's also, I think, recognizing what Ofsted inspectors really are in a position to be able to achieve in a short visit. There's so much significance that's being put on safeguarding now, and there are many people now in education who are saying that that inspection of safeguarding practice should be removed from the inspection framework, and that actually quality of teaching and quality of provision should actually be inspected separately from an inspection of safeguarding. And a safeguarding could happen on a snap basis. You could drop into any school around the country to be able to just check whether safeguarding is appropriate and in
mm,
place.
yeah.
And then that would mean that an inspection framework could look more in more detail, perhaps, at the quality of provision and the quality of learning that is going on within that institution.
Yeah, completely. And also the way in which they define safeguarding is quite problematic. There are there are quite a few cases. We've heard examples recently of, a child who was flossing and that was deemed to be sexualized behavior. Somebody else talked about a child who accidentally sat on another child's hand as they were sitting down, and that was treated as an incident that should have been written up and reported as a CP thing. I was once in a lesson, sorry, not in a lesson, it wasn't my lesson. I was working in a science department where it was a really hot day and they'd had the Bunsen burners on, and the teacher had opened the fire door to let some air in, and the lesson was given inadequate because of safeguarding, because the fire door was open. And so there is all kinds of sort of strange ways in which safeguarding is being defined, and in the basis on which these judgments are being formed is not, as you say, it's often not particularly transparent, and it doesn't seem particularly commonsensical.
No, and speaking to colleagues, there is in other schools I think there is a lot of concern about the nature of how hairs are set running in terms of the inspection regime of um, conversations with students, which then may well not be fully representative of what the student experience is at that school. Quite clearly, if there are concerns, they need to be addressed. But actually, sometimes it is quite clear that some of those conversations have been overinflated, and have led to schools finding themselves in difficult situations because of the views of an individual child or a small group of children.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So is there anything else that sort of that springs to mind as you look back over your career and you've been all of these inspections that you've been through, any sort of incidents, or without necessarily wanting to identify individuals, but is there anything that you sort of that you would point to and to suggest that here are some examples that of how inspection perhaps should not be done?
Yeah, well, I think we'd already talked about the idea that an inspector changing their judgment, and of course, none of us are grading lessons now, but at the time, it was a time when lessons were apparently to be graded,
Mm,
and at the time, Ofsted also was saying that they were objective about what they did. And I think the fact that you speak to an Ofsted inspector who then changes their mind suddenly makes you kind of think, well, actually, perhaps they're not as objective as perhaps ought to be.
mm,
I went through another experience of working with a subject team to be able to make sure that their curriculum challenge was increased. And the head of faculty was more than happy to be able to work with that. And we went on an exciting journey together to be able to raise the level of expectation about what we wanted for our Key Stage 3 students. As a result of that, their kind of the measurements that we were doing of those students inevitably dropped. And when we then had an Ofsted inspection, I did have to spend quite a lot of time trying to persuade the Ofsted inspector that the Key Stage 3 results, or not the results, but the Key Stage 3 assessments that we were doing for our students did not demonstrate that this one faculty was performing at a lower level, but in fact was wholly as a result of really productive and useful conversations about increasing the challenge within that subject area.
mm.
And it was very difficult. I found it very difficult for them to actually get their heads around that. It was almost as the fact that data told you the answers, whereas I think lots of us in education has always said, no, it doesn't. It just poses the question.
And so there's a sense that that's a really interesting example, isn't it? Because it feels like they've seen the data, and I imagine that they were then wondering, like, is this person just trying to pull the wool over my eyes with this, like, raising the challenge story? Are they trying to paper over the cracks here? And it's almost like they're just that's essentially what it feels like Ofsted is doing. It's like it's coming to catch you out at being naughty, at being wrong, at falling short of some sort of standard. That seems to be what underpinned that conversation. Would that be a fair way to characterize it? Do you think? Were they thinking, is this guy just trying to pull a fast one?
No, that wasn't actually what I thought their response was. I just
Okay,
thought, unfortunately, their response just seemed to be that this is the data, and so therefore that this must be the outcome. And they were actually quite intrigued by the response because it wasn't, and I was able to articulate it quite clearly. This
right,
was
okay.
a result of months of work that we've been doing on the curriculum. And this was the head teacher and lead inspector conversation. That's where she started with. So actually, I was going to come on to that narrative about how we were developing the curriculum, how we were developing assessment within the school. But actually, that was the starting point that I then had to sort of unpick before we then proceeded much further.
Right, I see. Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, okay. And just quickly to pick back up on the Christmas thing, that's really difficult to get my head around. They sent you an email on Christmas Eve. So they were working, and Christmas Eve is sometimes a working day, isn't it? But Christmas Day
Yes.
and Boxing Day aren't. They're bank
No.
holidays. And so they wrote to you on Christmas Eve and they were like, you need to get back. It's almost like something that happens in just like a not very well written film. It's just like such a Scroogey thing to do to send somebody a thing on Christmas Eve to say this needs to be back. So basically, you need to work on Christmas Day on a bank holiday. On Christmas Day, you need to get this back to me. And even when you said, hang on, that's ridiculous, it's Christmas, they said, oh, well, you can have 48 hours then, which is still basically like the first thing on the 27th, first thing after you've had these 2 days when people are still often visiting friends and family and what have you.
Yeah.
It's sort of astonishing that could even happen.
It, it's odd, but the reason being that actually I think the the framework allowed for a quicker turnaround or a quicker expected turnaround for nursery reports than it did for school reports. However, unfortunately, that wasn't made clear to me at the time. So I was basically saying I need a little bit more time to be able to turn this around. I think you're absolutely right. I think it is ridiculous to ask for somebody to turn around a report over the period of the Christmas break.
Mm,
What strangely happened almost 12 months to the day is that we then had an inspection of the school. 12 months later, because the school and the nursery were at the time being inspected separately. I then took my laptop away with me when we went away over Christmas to see family, waiting for the reports to appear, waiting for that same period of the 24 hours or possibly 48 hours to be able to send it back. And then did get some communication from Ofsted to say, no, it's different for schools. But I had spent that Christmas period sort of like going, well, hold on a minute, I could be expecting this at any moment, and I've got to get it turned around.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I see. So you were talking about there's there were issues around communication, and you could argue, that was a one-off thing. You're talking about the grading system, and lots of people are talking about that, and just the sense that the process is not as objective as people sometimes like to pretend like it is, as though these inspectors are sort of like a dispassionate pair of eyes that are reliably calibrated with the eyes of all the other Ofsted inspectors, and that this is somehow a standardized approach, a fair approach to measuring all schools on the same playing field. That's sort of the assumption that underpins it, and that overlooks all of the complexity in the fact that those Ofsted inspectors are human beings who are flawed, who are biased, who have very particular life experiences. Whether they, are a secondary school teacher who's then inspecting a primary or a nursery, or the other way around, or they're inspecting something that's out of their subject area, for example. And there's lots and lots of, or maybe they're just. Have you ever seen? There's some really interesting research that was done about judges. Judges were much more likely to acquit somebody of a crime if it was an hour and a half after breakfast. There's this window of time when they were more likely to be agreeable, more likely to be biddable, to be persuadable. And if it was out of that, their blood sugar was below a certain level, and they were just not making any favorable decisions towards the defendants. And it's a really interesting study. And that's not just judges that happens to. Like, people are fallible as anything. Like, we're really bad at making reliable, consistent judgments across time. And so there's this sense that we've just got this very, very subjective process that is sort of trying to pretend like it's wearing an objective clothes, objective outfit, what have you. And that's just not the lived experience of school leaders who think, actually, this is just like based on, whether the vibe in the room, is it like, is there a personality clash? Is it down to the ego of the inspector or the ego of the head teacher? Is it to the extent to which you acquiesce to their sort of requests or show that you're listening? There are so many factors involved, aren't there?
Yes, yeah, and I think the uncertainty sometimes about who that team may well be, who the lead inspector is, um, whether everybody is behaving in the same way, I think is a legitimate concern that needs to be explored. Actually, how far are Ofsted inspectors and lead inspectors making judgments that are not consistent with the practice of their of other inspectors in other institutions, even on the same day?
Yeah, interesting. So is there anything else in the challenges column before we move into possible solutions? How can we make this better?
I think there is a challenge, and I think it is useful to be able to get parental feedback and community feedback in terms of what's going on. It was obviously problematic many years ago, before the electronic system was used, that there was a paper system, and it was quite clear, I think, and there is evidence that head teachers in the past, and I know of a case where a head teacher may have amended some of those parental responses, those handwritten ones.
Interesting.
And I think it is important that we find a way of being able to get that voice accurately. There is an interesting situation, I think at the moment, with a school where parental voices was obtained for the Ofsted inspection, but now that the results are now not available. Normally they are available to the public, but that site has now been closed down currently. So there's obviously some problems that are going on in terms of accurately being able to collect data, which is informing the process effectively.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And surveys, you know, like with my social research hat on, like everybody's become quite trigger happy with surveys in recent years, haven't they? With Survey Monkey,
Mhm.
Monkey, and Google Forms and what have you. But it's really hard to write survey questions that actually do what you want them to do. And like, you know, if you're interested in political polling, like changing a single word in a political poll can completely massively influence the way that people respond to that question. And also, you know, who responds. Like if you're sort of a pretty busy parent who's pretty happy with the school, but doesn't really, you know, have any particular concerns, you
Mm.
probably aren't going to respond to that thing. Like if you're a particularly disagreeable person, if you've had a particular issue with a particular teacher, or if your child has been, you know, getting into trouble a lot and you're having lots of negative phone calls with the school, it's probably more likely that you're going to respond to that survey. And so,
Mhm.
you know, how fair and reliable is it in terms of sampling? Like, to what extent are they capturing an accurate sample, an accurate representation of parental views, or is it that people who've got an axe to grind, to put it bluntly, are more likely to see this as an opportunity to grind that axe and to extract their pound of flesh, as it were?
And yes, and I think that that's always going to, I think, be a problem with surveys and feedback, that actually you will hear. And it's the same with any lessons. And teachers know this very well, that actually you're not often congratulated on the successful learning that happens, but you're often picking up the child that hasn't quite understood it, or the parent that rings you up and says, "My child hasn't got this." So
Mm,
we're often, focusing upon, the problem issues, and quite rightly in many ways, because we want to be better. We want to be able to identify what's not going well. But that's why I think it's difficult to try to make sure that you have a successful survey that can really pick out the details of how successfully an organization is operating.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, and so at the moment, the chief inspector's job is up for grabs, as you may have noticed. So, if you were to be appointed to that role, I'm not sure whether you would want that mantle to be bestowed upon you. But if you were to be given a carte blanche to just do whatever you want, to change the way that the inspection system currently works, what would you do? What would you like to see more of? What would you like to see less of?
I don't think I would ever be chosen to fulfill that role. But to take your cue, I think what I would be looking for is to absolutely ensure that there is still that level of accountability, and accountability to the communities that we serve, and that therefore there shouldn't be any of that lost. However, I think what there needs to be lost from the process is this high stakes and high impact, in terms of what happens to a school once that Ofsted team have gone. And actually, the position the school can find itself in and the support networks. And I think a lot of support should be found within the narrative and the direction of what's being written within the Ofsted reports. I think there should also be a framework where there is a collaborative approach between institutions, organisations, whether that's not just Ofsted, but also multi-academy trusts, local authorities, to be able to make sure there is effective support in place so that schools are not left isolated, that they can feel supported, and that they can address some of those issues that have been raised, to be able to make sure that they can then move on successfully. It's great for
Okay.
those schools that are identified that they're doing a good job. They can then continue moving on. But even for those schools, there should be identified areas where actually they can still improve further. They can still develop their practice.
Mm, yeah, okay. And so what might that look like in practice? Have you thought about like is this that Ofsted would have some sort of like a school improvement partnership network aspect to it, so that there was a judge, you know, a bit like sometimes it's senior leaders, like sometimes the head of teaching and learning is simultaneously in charge of essentially being like a mini Ofsted inspector who's going around and
Yeah,
checking on people and doing compliance and capability stuff. And they're also in charge of appraisal and professional development. And sometimes people are like, it's really hard to do both of those roles, to do the
I think it
accountability
is.
role
Yeah,
and the support role at the same
yeah,
time.
I think it is, and so I don't think that Ofsted necessarily itself should be a school improvement provider, but I think it should work closely with those organisations that are in that position to be able to do that. Because I think you've hit the nail on the head with the issue that you've got within school. I don't think it's effective for somebody who is in charge of an initiative to also be the person that evaluates how successful that initiative has been. You can end up with all sorts of problems with that. So I think there needs to be an element of an external evaluation of how an institution is working. But I think what I'm also concerned about is the reduction in capacity across the sector to be able to make sure that schools are effectively supported. What we're
Yeah.
seeing instead is a kind of like sometimes a bartering of schools, or schools being sold off to a different multi-academy trust. And in effect, that is no different from actually just saying, okay, we're just going to change the personnel and actually move that school around. I
Mm-hmm.
think it may well lead to improvement, but it may well not. And there are cases where schools have been passed around from one trust to another because nobody is making an impact on it. And I think whilst a trust is then able to move on, my focus is upon what about the community? What about the children who are going to that school, the children who are yet to go to that school? Where's the security? Where's the structure that's being built so they can really see that there's a proper future in place for them?
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I see. And it sounds like you're talking about something that's much more formative rather than summative. Like an Ofsted inspection is a summative assessment, isn't it? It's like you get a grade at the end of it, or a series of grades, but it all boils down to one grade.
Mm.
And it isn't that formative piece that's about like how can we help you get better in an ongoing way, and collecting data and having targets that you can be held accountable for. Um, would be an important part of that formative process, but it's just much more improvement focused and also strengths focused, just to say like what is going really well here, and to celebrate that, rather than this sort of deficit model whereby each school, even if you're a good school, like that like there's still the sort of the clear implication there that you're not outstanding. It always makes me laugh a little bit when you see one of those banners outside of a school and you see the outstanding banners, but you sort of see some banners that say this is a good school. And you sort of think like that word is just so sort of underwhelming. It's like this is a good school. Like it's basically like saying we're not in the naughty category, but it doesn't feel like cause for putting a banner up outside the school. But is
No,
it? Go on, sorry.
I, I think that what happened with the decision to not inspect outstanding schools was a grave error, because schools change and they can change very quickly.
Yeah,
And I think the decision that was made years ago to have outstanding schools not being inspected was one that I think we are now seeing the consequences of. Um, I'm been more than happy to just lead schools that have been identified as good. We've not been racing the outstanding banner. We've never put out banners outside our school. In the last two schools I've been in, we've not done that, and we because for the simple reason, as you point out before, you don't that slap the outcome of your MOT certificate across your windscreen. So we are happy that we communicate with parents and we tell them about what we're doing. We get parental feedback about what we're doing. We sometimes get parental criticism about what we're doing, and that's what we'll respond to. But we don't put banners up. We don't put
yeah,
banners up to be able to say yes, we're a good school, and even if we were outstanding school, which of course there are much fewer of those around about now, but I would much prefer that those blunt labels go, and then
yeah.
actually schools are just have a much more sensitive approach to what we're doing.
I completely agree. I wonder whether that decision to stop inspecting outstanding schools was done partly because they were overstretched. They were like, there's 30,000 schools. It's not got that big a budget, Ofsted, has it? It's only about 130 million a year or something. Like, in the grand scheme of things, to be inspecting that many schools, or maybe it's 22,000 in England. I might be wrong. That's a lot to do. And part of the stuff that I've been thinking and talking about recently around this, but one of the ideas is that because it's so overstretched, that it's that's a big problem. You know, if you're not inspecting a school, even if they see a school every 4 or 5 years, that's not making sure that school is safe. Like you say, a lot can happen within 4 or 5 years. And so an idea that seems to be coalescing, people seem to be coalescing around, is this idea that, as you said earlier, that you vastly slim it down. You just make it about doing an annual safety check to make sure everyone's okay. And also we need to look at how they define safety and safeguarding, because that seems to have gone a bit weird. And then have the other stuff, like you say, around curriculum, leadership and management, you know, defining what learning is and all that stuff that Ofsted has been rolling up its sleeves and getting involved in these deep discussions and taking a very partisan stance on some interesting, you know, contested areas. And kicking all of that out, like you say, to school improvement partners and organizations, and as well to other schools, so that there's a peer review process where you could match up a school with another school, and they inspect each other with a vertical slice team of senior leaders, middle leaders, early career teachers, possibly students, parents, governors, you know, getting a really rich picture. As you say, you know, spend a week in each other's schools, you know, and if each year, let's say once a term, in one term you have a safety check, in one term you go and inspect another school, and in the third term another school comes and inspects you. So there's this continuous process of A, making sure everyone's safe, and B, this iterative process of soft, supportive accountability, where you're sort of saying to this other school, oh yeah, this is what we're going to try and do this year. Come and see us next year and check on how we're doing. And they want to be able to have a good story to tell around that. And that seems to be, I don't know, that's just my current sort of back of the envelope picture of what this might look like.
And I get that. And I have been part in the past of processes where different schools, organized in different ways, have collaborated with each other in order to provide that kind of peer review, peer support sort of system. I think what's interesting now is a lot of school improvement work is now being put in the hands of multi-academy trusts. And actually, I think in itself creates a bit of a problem, because what you've got then is that focus within an organization of it, putting in the implementation of the strategies, and also in effect reviewing how successful they're being until an Ofsted comes along, as opposed to different organizations collaborating with each other, so that there isn't that sort of like focus on we are one coherent body of a multi-academy trust or whatever. But actually, you've got a sort of a federation of different schools from different organizations, so that actually you can see it's much more of a transparent process.
Yeah, I can see that, and it would also just break down that sort of us and them thing. You know, if the multi-academy trust is sort of, like you say, it's like doing its own stuff and marking its own homework, it's trying to make its schools better than other schools in the local area, rather than better with, you know. And I think that, you know, there's nothing wrong with a bit of competition. I think that competition can be a healthy thing and can be a driver for innovation and growth, but there's a balance to be struck, isn't there, between collaboration and competition?
Oh yes.
And it feels like, you know, that there's maybe a bit too much competition and not quite enough collaboration and sharing across, like you say, across different types of organizations, different types of schools. I've done some really interesting work around this peer review idea with, you know, mainstream schools going into special needs schools and vice versa. And so much rich learning happens as a consequence of those visits. It's absolutely remarkable.
Yes, yeah, really, really valuable experience for all the staff who were involved in those as well, in terms of the visitors as well as those being visited.
Absolutely, yes, yeah, great stuff. Okay, so is there anything that you'd like to say in wrapping up? Is there anything that we haven't covered today that you'd like to add before we close this?
No, I think it's been a really good discussion. Thank you. But I think there is so much of a spotlight now in terms of whether Ofsted is currently, whatever it was designed to be, whether in fact its current mode of operation is a force for good and
Mm,
is a force for development of schools, or whether in fact there are some things that need to be either removed, changed, altered, or fundamentally changed. And I think we are at a point now where I think Ofsted as an organisation needs to seriously self-review, as it expects many schools to, in the same process, to be actually think, is this working?
mm,
Having gone through so many different Ofsted inspections in my career, it has been quite clear that there is that sense of constant change. And so there hasn't always been one model of what Ofsted have reviewed or the methodology that it has used.
yeah.
So it is not unreasonable to expect that that organisation could continue that process to actually see, well, what do we do under the next few years, and what is right for schools in that sort of situation now.
Yeah, yeah. That's a fascinating note to end on. Thanks for that. This idea that because Ofsted itself changes over time, you're like, well, which is the good Ofsted? Like which is the one like if a school performed brilliantly in the, you know, 1994 framework and now it's now not so much, or vice versa, which was the good school? Like that's a really interesting question. The lack of consistency across time sort of undermines the whole thing, really, doesn't it?
Mm.
Interesting. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts and experiences with me. It does feel like we're at a moment here, doesn't it? Like Ofsted's response has been not great to this whole sort of crisis. I think it's fair to call it a crisis that's emerged in the last few weeks. And I think it's partly because they didn't see this coming. I don't think that they have a plan or potentially the right people in place, who knows, to be able to implement those changes. And so I think that there's a sort of a sense of just trying to hold the line and hope that this goes away. But I don't see this going away. It feels like something's changed in the profession. Is that something that you would that resonates with you, that idea?
I think so. Yes, I think there is a real demand now for the organisation to review actually how it works and the impact that it's having on. We already know that there is a recruitment crisis. We know that actually many people are not wanting to step up to leadership. And actually, if Ofsted just need to consider why that might well be, and do they have any role within the decisions that people are making in terms of going into education or becoming a leader in education, then it's perhaps right that they look at themselves with the same intensity that they look at schools around the country.
Indeed, they need to go and have a little think about what they've done, and how this might be playing out for other people. Absolutely, yeah. So and they are really good at inspecting people. There's lots of very, very effective professional knowledge within that organization. If they turn their gaze inward, that could be an interesting little Easter exercise for them. They could do that on Easter Sunday.
Indeed.
I want it on my desk on Easter Monday morning.
Give them 24 hours over Easter Sunday, yes.
All right. Thank you for that. It's been really
Thank you.
enjoyable conversation.
Okay, thank you.